Hi there. This is part 2 of my speculative analysis on what the future Tales of Dunk and Egg prequel novellas are about to Game of Thrones. Because only 3 are finished out of a planned 12, and there's 10-year time skips in the middle of it. And more importantly, how would you make TV shows based on this material? Now, in part 1 I explained there's a really good stopping point at what's really apparently the 7th novella would be the 3rd Blackfire Rebellion. Big war climax, which is then followed by a 12-year time skip. So that seems like a pretty good point to end on. Also because the actors would age into it, that the first one starts in the year 209, the third and most current one is in 211. The 3rd Rebellion is in 219. So covering 10 years of in-universe history with a 7-season TV show doesn't run into age issues. But he said these 12 novellas are supposed to cover 50 years, the full lives of these characters until they're old men, when Egg is a grandfather. So you would need to recast at least once, and the second half, there's much less source material in hand, and there's a lot more time skips. How would you handle that? And to skip to my conclusion, and this is all speculative, we wouldn't even have to worry about this for 10 years. I think the best way to do this is to treat the second half when Egg is king, not so much as Tales of Dunk and Egg anymore, but as a direct prequel to the events of the War of the Five Kings, dealing with people from other great houses coming into the story. And it actually flows pretty organically, because that's what happened. Case in point, that the second half of this overlaps with the rise of Tywin Lannister culminating in the Rain Rebellion. And Martin has said he thinks that should be a standalone story, that he has publicly remarked and made videos about it. He said, if I ever sat down and fully narrativized it, that would be like 3 short books. Which you think, like, the rebellion itself against the Rains the Rain Rebellion is only in the 3rd one. If it's a 3-act structure, well, then Act 1 would be the War of the Wombs between his mother and Lady Rain, and then Act 2 would be his father Tytos comes to rule Casterly Rock, but he's really bad at it. And then culminate with the Rain Rebellion. That's like a 3-act, 3-season show. Maybe we shouldn't... I've had other videos where I talk about these are all the potential spin-offs, and I do list that as one of them. Maybe the second half of a Dunk and Egg show should really be merged with ideas they have for a young Tywin and the Rain Rebellion show, is the whole point of this video. Which actually flows pretty organically, because if these were ever in print, Tywin would be a character by the 11th novella. He'd have to be, because he's at the royal court as a squire. So it overlaps organically that much of this would involve the Lannisters. And enough of the other things, like the duel with Laughing-Storm, involve the Baratheons, that work in other things like the Tyrells with Olenna, pad it out a little with other things we know were happening from the World of Ice and Fire. But the big one is merge all the Lannister stuff with it. And I'm going to link in the description box below to the free preview chapter that Martin posted of the History of the Westerlands thing from World of Ice and Fire. Not only is it free, it's actually slightly longer than the edited for space and time version that they put in the print book. So there's a little more level of detail in it, which is great, of just what happened that led up to that. And again, remember, the Rain Rebellion itself would be the 3rd season. It's all the plotting and intrigue leading up to that. The fact that they even call it the War of the Wombs, that before Tywin is even born, that Lady Rain was having lots of children and naming them after dead Lannisters as a take that at them, all this spiteful stuff. So how would that line up? Well, when you look at it at a timeline, it makes pretty good sense. As I said, 3rd Blackfire Rebellion would be the final season of the first half, corresponding to the 7th planned novella, that's the year 219. Then there's a 12-year time skip because, well, the year after that, Egg marries Betha Blackwood for love, because he was a minor princeling. They didn't think, oh, he needs a marriage alliance yet. But the year after that, 2 years after the 3rd Blackfire Rebellion, King Aerys I died, his older uncle who didn't have any children, who was kind of a weakling, and thus was directly succeeded by Egg's father, Maekar. And when you look at World of Ice and Fire, there's only a single page on the reign of Maekar, but it does explain not much happened. There weren't major rebellions because, unlike his weakling brother, Maekar was a strong warrior and no one was stupid enough to rebel against him. You know, obviously, first and foremost, the Blackfires, more than all the other local rebels like the Greyjoys or whatever, the Blackfires were not stupid enough to challenge him. They said, we'll just have to wait this out. And he ended up ruling for 12 years. So, 12-year time skip. What I think the 8th novella will be about is the Great Council that makes Egg king. This would be the 8th novella overall, but would be season 1 of the direct sequel show to A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Because the format's different. Once he's king, he's not even wandering. The format is totally different. He's not wandering around getting into adventures anymore. It shifts to being politics and stuff. So you'd have to play around with that. But in a relatively minor local rebellion at Pike, Maekar gets his head crushed in by a stone thrown from the castle battlements. Egg then gets made king at the Great Council, even though they offer it to his brother Maester Aemon, who refuses. And this Great Council also sees Bloodraven exiled to the Wall, because he killed a Blackfire who came to the Great Council in good faith, who even wrote ahead, do you promise me safe passage if I put forward my claim to this Great Council? Yes. Instant he shows up, he beheads him with Dark Sister. And he said, I knew this every step of the way. I was planning to kill him. And I know you're going to sentence me to death or something for this, but I think I'm sacrificing my honor to get rid of one more Blackfire. And I think it's worth it. But rather than death, they give him the option to join the Night's Watch, and he does, and eventually becomes Lord Commander and does other stuff. But, okay, this is shooing out Bloodraven's final thing. A lot of stuff would happen in that 8th novella, which would make for an interesting first season of a new show. That's the 8th novella, which would in turn be a TV season. And by the way, we don't know the exact names. The names for some of these we have, but they're so vague as to be meaningless, that out of the novellas we don't have yet, they're titled The Sellsword, The Champion, The Kingsguard, and The Lord Commander. So I'm not going by title to figure out what the stories are. I'm going by the timeline of, well, then what happened next, according to World of Ice and Fire. Peak uprising of the Great Council were 233. Relatively soon after that, 3 years later, 236 is the 4th Blackfire Rebellion, which was smaller scale but more directly involved Egg and Dunk. Egg is king, and Dunk led their forces. That, okay, Maekar was too strong to challenge, there's this weakling half-peasant king, let's attack him. And under Daemon III Blackfire, they land in the Stormlands at Massey's Hook, and they head west, but they thought, well, we'll land in the Stormlands, win a few victories, it'll lead to a general uprising. It didn't, because, and the World of Ice and Fire says, this was 40 years after Daemon Blackfire I died, and so many people who fought in the first rebellion were because they were personally loyal to him, and these just seemed like this ragtag army of foreign mercenaries waving tattered banners. So there wasn't a general uprising in their favor, and not long after they landed at the climactic Battle of Wendwater Bridge in the Stormlands, Duncan the Tall slew Daemon III Blackfire in personal combat. So it's a smaller scale rebellion, but it more personally involves Dunk. Fine. This is clearly what's supposed to be the 9th novella. Then the time skips start getting a little more drastic here. The next big event was, this is story 10, the failed marriage alliances with all of Egg's children. Because he married for love, they insisted, you can't force me into marriage alliances. And the end result was these alliances were ruined, it alienated a lot of the great houses and left them very vulnerable when the Mad King happened a generation later. That they were growing very distant from the great houses. And politically this ruined things for them. Well, World of Ice and Fire says he started planning these in 237, but the one that the novellas are snapshots. They happen at one point in time, but then through vivid narration will say this is what happened. Like the second novella is 2 years after the first, but spends a lot of time saying this is what happened in the plague that happened off screen. That kind of thing. But I think story 10 would be about Jenny of Oldstones and the duel with the Laughing Storm. That Egg's eldest son, Crown Prince Duncan the Small, he named him after Dunk, abdicated to marry the mysterious commoner Jenny of Oldstones, who they said she was a woods witch, that she consorted with children of the forest, even though she did come to the royal court. We don't really know, but he was promised to marry the daughter of Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, one of Dunk and Egg's oldest allies, who had fought on Dunk's side at the Trial of Seven in the Hedge Knight. And it says that he was so offended it led to a brief but bloody rebellion, climaxing with the great duel between the King's Guard, Duncan the Tall, and the Laughing Storm, which is so big that the World of Ice and Fire is this full-page artwork of them sizing each other up before this trial by combat. So that's clearly going to be the 10th story. Then the younger children also rejected their marriage alliances, but I think we'd learn of that through vivid narration in the 11th story. But going by timeline, Jenny of Oldstones and Laughing Storm was 239. Moving on after that by timeline, the next few years saw the younger children also rejecting their matches, that a year later, 240, Jaehaerys II and Shera married for love. They eloped. It's a whole reverse psychology thing that you told them, no, don't have incest, so they did. He was supposed to marry a Tully girl. She was supposed to marry Luther Tyrell. That got ruined. Then 6 years later, the youngest child, Daeron, repudiated his match to the young and gorgeous Olenna Redwine, but he wasn't attracted to her. And then Olenna went on to marry Luther Tyrell. I don't think we'd actually see that in a single novella, that by the 11th novella they'd retroactively say what happened, because they said Daeron didn't live that many years after that he repudiated the match in 246, only to then die 5 years later in 251, leading an army against the Rat, the Hawk, and the Pig. We don't know what that is, but they were also in the 6th novella 30 years before. That's weird. But looking at where you would logically place novellas, I think you'd have the 11th novella during the Rat, the Hawk, and the Pig round 2 in 251, which, if you think about it, that's like 10 years after Jenny of Oldstones. On the other hand, a TV show wouldn't need to do a 10-year time skip and then go back and say this through vivid narration. Like, they would go chronologically, and then in episode 3, Jaehaerys and Shera would marry. In episode 5, Daeron would repudiate Olenna. That still, this covers 10 years of in-universe time. Would you need to recast Dunk and Egg with older men at this point? Or, given that it's like a 40-year-old actor already, maybe they could just do it with age makeup. I think. I'm not really sure. Well, Rat, Hawk, and the Pig is 251, and then 8 years later is the tragedy at Summerhall, which is clearly story number 12. While we don't have that much source material, I think this overlaps with the Lannister stuff so much you really could work this out. Now I'm going to go back through the timeline, overlaying what the Lannisters were doing. To start with, it comes organically that old Lord Gerald Lannister had 3 sons, Tywald, Tyon, and Tydos. Tydos is Tywin's father. The first 2 sons died, and left that Tydos was the younger brother who was never prepared to rule, and he was unfit for it. Well, the oldest brother, Tywald, died in the Peak Uprising. Like, he would die on the page in a print 8th novella. And then in the 9th novella, his younger brother, Tyon, would die in the 4th Blackfire Rebellion. So they'd be popping up in this story organically, and at least mentioning them. I don't know if they'd be in Dunk's perspective. So you'd see them doing that. It would leave Tydos as the weak heir to Casterly Rock. Then they could spend half a season showing him with deteriorating conditions. Now, to write this out, the way I think they could do this, just to cut to the chase, is Season 1, which is also Season 8 if you're counting it as one big thing, but this is the sequel show. Season 1 would be the 8th novella, the Peak Uprising and the Great Council, plus you'd see the oldest Lannister brother die. Season 2, 9th novella, 4th Blackfire Rebellion, the second Lannister boy dies. Season 3 would be Jenny of Oldstones, the duel with Laughing Storm. But then by season 4, around this time, you'd start seeing that this is when his father dies, so Tytos comes to rule and he's really bad at it. So season 4, you'd have the rat, the hawk, and the pig, the death of Daeron. Also, I think they go chronologically and cover this is how, not just how Olenna got rejected, but how the other two married each other, so they screwed up relations with the Tullys and the Tyrells. All of that on the Dunk and Egg side of things. But increasingly, like, as a B plot throughout eating up like half of the screen time, increasingly, season 4 would be the War of the Wombs between Tywin's mother and Lady Rain. And this would culminate towards the end of that, after all of season 4, seeing how bad Tytos is at holding the Westerlands together. It even mentions that Egg had to send armies in to restore order in the Westerlands. He was so bad. It will culminate with Tywin telling off Tytos over that marriage for his sister so publicly that they send him as a squire to the Red Keep. So season 5, Tywin would be in the Red Keep storyline. But season 5, of course, is the lead up to the events of the tragedy of Summerhall. And maybe also off-screen, actually intercut with showing the Band of Nine rising to power in the Free Cities, where they're just this outlaw alliance, one of which is a Blackfire, because Dunk is the one who came up with the name, the Ninepenny Kings, as an old man of, the Ninepenny Kings there. But like before, like with Maekar, Egg was such a strong king by this point, they realized, let's wait for him to die, then attack when his new successor is not yet firm in control. So then, this would overlap with what would have been the Tywin show. That, okay, season 5 ends with Dunk and Egg dying. Immediately, the War of the Ninepenny Kings happened. The 5th Blackfire Rebellion would be season 6, about Jaehaerys II actually dealing with that. They said he was weak and sickly, but personality-wise, he was a firm administrator, and a young Barristan Selmy killing the last Blackfire pretender in the Stepstones. And you meet a lot of other younger characters, like Catelyn's father, Hoster Tully. He was fighting in the Stepstones. Tywin was already a knight, but he really... The Tywin and his brothers blooded themselves and rose to be men and warriors fighting in the Stepstones. So the War of the Ninepenny Kings, it's continuing that, but it's really showing the rise of Tywin as this young buck, this young warrior. And then season 7, you'd see him come back and set things to rights in the Westerlands, culminating in the Rain Rebellion. I think you could very easily do that and fit it into a 7-season format. I'm just rambling here because I'm going to revisit this at some point in the next 10 years anyway. But it's padded out with the stuff we know the Lannisters were doing. The Baratheons are intimately involved in terms of the other great houses. Laughing Storm plays a major role. Tullys and Tyrells come in. The one exception is the Starks aren't really in this, except for the Wildling invasion by Raymun Redbeard. Problem is, that happened way back in 226 AC, during the 12-year time skip, which is the break between these two series. That it's Raymun Redbeard, Baron Stark is the youngest grandson of Cregan, and they have the She-Wolves of Winterfell. They visit as Baron is on his deathbed, from a wound taken in battle. This much later, Baron's grandson Willem is killed at the Battle of Long Lake by Raymun Redbeard. But then the Starks rally and they manage to fight them off. How would you handle the Raymun Redbeard invasion when it happens like a good 7 years before the Peak Uprising, and would not appear in a Dunk and Egg novella as such, but World of Ice and Fire? This is the thing the Starks did in all of this time. So, do a flashback? I don't think this should be... Should this be in Season 1? I think to get people's attention, it should be in Season 1 of that potential new show. Looking at my chart here, but how would you fit the Starks in when the one big noteworthy thing they did happened in the break between seasons? Fit it in flashbacks or something. But otherwise, you got a decent amount of stuff with older Dunk and Egg, and increasingly with the great houses that they spurned, like young Olenna Redwine. You'd see young Barristan, and just the rise of Tywin. Looking at my notes here, I realized, instead of treating these as two different shows, we should treat them as one show, particularly because there isn't that much source material in hand yet. That if things change, if Martin whips out Fire and Blood Part 2 in the next 3 years, we'll reassess this. But that's how I think the entire lives of Duncan Egg, from the Hedge Knight through the Rain Rebellion, could make 2 TV shows of 7 seasons each. Maybe not 10-episode seasons, but you could do that. I realized the point of this video is just merge the young Tywin stuff with late Duncan Egg as one show, rather than go, oh, well, this is, you don't know what's happening in She-Hulk here in this episode because you didn't watch Hawkeye. Just make it one big combined show. And by that point, the franchise will be established enough that if we're coming off a successful 7-year-long Tales of Duncan Egg the Hedge Knight thing, people will be eager for this again, to just have more spin-offs for the sake of spin-offs. And we'll love it because we love content. But that's my point here, that they overlap organically so much when you realize that Titus's first brother died in the Peak Uprising, his second brother died in the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion, that the Lannisters are increasingly falling into the orbit of Duncan Egg's story, culminating with, around the end of the 11th novella, you'd expect Tywin to show up at the Red Keep as, hi, I'm your grandson's new sworn sword. I think you could do this. So this is why I pushed this into part 2. It's a lot more speculative and rambling, and we don't need to worry about this for 7 to 10 years. I already said everything I needed to in part 1, which is there's this obvious stopping point with what's blatantly the 7th novella is Third Blackfire Rebellion followed by a 12-year time skip, is a good endpoint for this set of actors in this current show they're casting, which they'd age roughly in real time, 10 years of in-universe story covered in 7 seasons. You can do that. After that, I don't think it would be strictly a Duncan Egg adaptation, but things from World of Ice and Fire we know were happening in the later reign of Egg overlapping with young Tywin. You can do that. But we don't have to worry about that for right now. But just if you're asking what's my opinion on all of this, just to get it out there, I'm rushing this out, that's how I think you should handle it. Merge those two and stop treating them as 2 distinct prequels. But, well, he even says, like, even in the War of the Wombs, when Tytos was failing, like, Egg got increasingly frustrated with him. You're barely holding the Westerlands together. Would they need to recast Duncan Egg by the last 2 seasons, when they're really in their 60s? Or would you just have a 40-year-old in age makeup? Given how little they seem to be doing in those seasons, it's not action-oriented anymore. I think you easily could, rather than spoil the actor, but I'm worried about someone who hasn't been cast for a show from 10 years from now. But I think you could do that.